Oh my gosh, y'all. Chapter 26, The Conservative Turn, 1969 to 1988. This is my third take, I think, on this video because there's so much and it's so convoluted, a lot of it, and it's hard to know what to say, and keeping myself brief is really a challenge. So there's a lot to say about this chapter, and I'll try and just offer a few things that will I hope will help you hold a lot of the disparate elements here together. So one thing is just to think through what's happening in the world as a whole. So during these decades that we're talking about, we enter the third phase of the Cold War. So the Vietnam conflict comes to an end, and then the rest of the 70s and into the 80s is the last decade and change of the Cold War, in which the United States and the Soviet Union don't go at it head to head, and there's not even like one place like Vietnam where they're sort of competing with each other behind the scenes, but it's more diffuse. There's a number of battlefields throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The main ones to consider are Afghanistan, Iran and Iraq, and then in Africa there's South Africa and the civil wars in Angola and Mozambique, and then Nicaragua in Central America. Those are some of the main places where the Cold War takes place, in sort of a multi-front, diffuse phase of the Cold War. That's one piece. Another piece is thinking through sort of the global economic situation. So remember, one element of the Washington world order after World War II has to do with economic development, right? Guaranteeing free trade and freedom of the seas so that people can prosper. That's the idea, right? And this really works in Western Europe and our allies in East Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and that means that manufacturing really increases in those places, and U.S. manufacturing begins to lose its primacy for that and a couple of other reasons. So there's some long-term changes in the global economy that are starting to affect the United States. Another piece that we need to know in this context has to do with energy prices, right? There's a couple of oil shocks in the 1970s that dramatically, overnight increased the price of oil, which has an effect on inflation and so forth, ripple effects throughout the global economy. And this is stuff that the normal tools that the U.S. policymakers had to be able to regulate the economy that come out of the New Deal, these normal tools don't seem to work anymore in the 1970s, and that has certainly an effect on the Nixon, Ford, and definitely the Carter administration, and sets the stage for Reagan to be able to come into the presidency in 1980. He's inaugurated in 1981, with the argument that government itself is the problem, right? That the people of the United States, the economic power of the United States, has been compromised because there's too much regulation, too much taxation. The power of the economy has been really strangled by too much government. Maybe I'll have a chance to talk about that in a minute as well, right? So the other thing that I wanted to point out has to do with Nixon and understanding Nixon as a political figure. He's a complex person to understand. I think the textbook does a really good job. If you know Nixon already, it's because of the Watergate scandal. And I hope you'll learn more about the Watergate scandal, and you'll also learn more about Nixon. You'll learn about Nixon and the Cold War, Nixon and Vietnam, certainly, Nixon and domestic policy, just to relate to some discussions that we've had before, and also to the primary source essay that you have on your final, which comes from this chapter. Nixon has a pretty important environmental record, which might not be exactly what you expect, right? The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Environmental Protection Agency. These are responses to this environmental movement, this grassroots movement that you see reflected in your primary document. I'd ask you to pay attention, you'll see in your directions on the final, pay attention to not just to what's happening in the United States in terms of the economy and people beginning to think through what have been some of the unintended consequences of this post-World War II economic boom, but also one of the questions that is asked on the final is, what does Earth Day have to do with the civil rights movement? Because at first glance, that's two different things, right? Well, maybe one way to ask it is, could Earth Day, as described in that document, could that have even been conceived? Could that have been executed at the level of technique and tactics and so forth, were it not for the success of the civil rights movement? Like, could people have even been able to think of Earth Day if the Black freedom struggle had not done so much to change the consciousness of the country? So I hope you'll enjoy kind of puzzling through that and try, and it's a part of understanding that, okay, this chapter is called The Conservative Turn, but the progressive impulse from the 1960s is not all lost. Maybe it gets turned around in different ways and takes on different forms in the 1970s and 1980s, but it's not entirely gone. And maybe the environmental movement is one way that we could see that. Okay, Nixon. You know Nixon because of Watergate, and rightfully so. We also really have to understand Nixon in the context of Vietnam, and of course Vietnam and Watergate are intimately connected to each other. You know Watergate because, in general, I mean, if you haven't studied it before, it's that Nixon did some stuff that was wrong, or other people, you know, there's a break-in, and some people went to jail, and so corruption and whatever. So one of the terms that comes out of the Watergate scandal is dirty tricks. That is, and that comes from Nixon, and that's using methods that are questionable or flatly illegal in order to smear your political opponents, to gain advantage, to get into power, and to stay in power. Dirty tricks, right? And dirty tricks, in fact, on the part of the Republican Party leadership, start at least as early as 1964 with the Goldwater campaign, which pioneers techniques of voter suppression and calling into account the integrity of the vote. That should sound familiar if you've been paying attention just the last few years. There's also some documentation that came to light just a few years ago that confirmed what was long suspected, which was that the Nixon campaign in 1968, when Nixon is running against Johnson, had done something to scuttle the peace talks in Vietnam. Johnson had a plan that he was implementing that was going to bring the Vietnam conflict to an end, or at least be able to announce the plan before the November election in 1968. And it was suspected that Nixon had done something to get the South Vietnamese government to back out of the peace talks, but there wasn't quite enough proof, and now there are notes from inside the Nixon White House that show that they did use, from inside the Nixon campaign. He wasn't president yet. That's the important piece. Private citizens of the United States are not allowed to conduct foreign policy. The government does that. The federal government does that. If you go do foreign policy yourself, especially if it's a secret, that is called a felony, my loves. And that, in fact, is called treason. I don't use that word just, every day. So the Nixon campaign promised that if South Vietnam would back out of the peace talks with the Johnson administration, then Nixon would win in November and Nixon would give South Vietnam a better deal. So not only is that against the law, not only is that treason on its face. I'm not a lawyer, but you don't have to be a lawyer to figure this out. We also know now how much worse the Vietnam conflict got under Nixon before it ended, right? More U.S. soldiers died, way more Southeast Asians died. The Nixon administration actually expanded the war into Laos and Cambodia. The domestic political consequences were severe. This is an unconscionable action, right, for cynical political gain. Why has this not entered more the consciousness of the country since it came out in 2017? Well, 2017, friends. There was a whole lot of other stuff happening in 2017, and so this hasn't like caught on. But as a historian, kind of looking for, where are the documents, where's the proof, I'm satisfied that those rumors are true, and that helps us make better sense of Watergate, right? If Nixon is willing to do that, then he's willing to do anything else in 1972 that will help keep him in power, especially when he knows that like the domestic unrest, mostly surrounding Vietnam, is getting much worse. And so he can sort of justify things and say, well, whatever kind of tactics we have to use to keep order in the country and to make sure I win re-election, those are justified. Mercy. It's a lot. It's serious. The other thing I have to point out is that these dirty tricks did not stop in 1972 with what became known as the Watergate scandal. Other Republican candidates and presidents used them as well. Just to give a quick example, there's the careers of Roger Stone and Paul Manafort, who cut their teeth in the 70s working for the Nixon campaign. Stone was one of the dirty tricksters who spied on the campaigns of Democratic rivals, and he literally has Nixon's face tattooed on his shoulder. I am not making this up. Look it up. He became famous later in 2000 in the contested election between Al Gore and George W. Bush. He became famous as the leader of the Brooks Brothers riot. That's where these political operatives of the Republican Party went to stop the voting recount in Miami-Dade County because it was Florida that was in dispute. This is in the next chapter, but I'm trying to draw these connections, right? And then it basically threw the election to the U.S. Supreme Court. And a very, very strange decision that basically just assigned the electoral votes to George W. Bush. And then Manafort went on to represent dictators and oligarchs in Russia and Ukraine in the early 2000s. He made his money doing deals to keep democracy out of Ukraine. And then he and Stone both went to work for the Trump campaign in 2016. Manafort became his campaign manager. Y'all can look all of this up. I think it's I'm not a partisan. I think you know that. I think it is very important that we be able to cut through a lot of nonsense and sort of analyze clearly who is who and the careers of some of these folks over the long duration. My gosh, it's 14 minutes and I haven't said anything about Reagan yet. I'm not going to say anything more about Reagan, except that I did mention, Afghanistan and Nicaragua, and looking at him in terms of the Cold War and his approach to prosecuting the Cold War that had some elements of dirty tricks as well. But the other thing that I would just return to is the Reagan administration was the beginning of taking steps to dismantle a lot of the New Deal state. The thing is, it turns out that individual programs of New Deal America, the general idea of having a government that takes care of people, that regulates the economy, that is, the best defender of people's rights. Those are actually, in and of themselves, very popular items when you poll Americans. So how is it that Reagan was able to begin to dismantle elements of the New Deal state? To make a long story short, you have to call it something else. You have to identify what you're doing as something else. Okay, this is way too long already. Let's call that good for now. I wish you all the best in the discussion, and I'll try and weigh in this week and help clarify anything that I can. All right.